Before we begin, I want to be clear. This is not medical or psychological advice. What you're about to hear is a personal story. It's one woman's journey through loss, love, and what came after. Her experience may not be exactly like yours, but if you've lost someone, especially a spouse, you may find pieces of your own story here too. Her name is Susan. She was 56 years old when her husband passed away after a long and painful battle with cancer. They had been married for 31 years. That day, everything changed. The house was the same, but it felt different. The world kept turning, but time for her seemed to pause. The silence became heavier than the noise. In the months that followed, Susan uncovered 12 lessons, not the kind you read in books or hear in support groups. These were quiet realizations that came to her in the middle of doing dishes, folding laundry, or lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling. Some of these truths were painful. Others brought comfort. All of them were hard-earned. If you're a widow, or if you've loved someone who was and want to understand more, this story is for you. It isn't about moving on. It's about learning to live differently, to carry the love and the loss at the same time, to find light again, in your own way, at your own pace. So wherever you are right now, sitting at your kitchen table, driving home from work, or listening in the stillness of your bedroom, I invite you to take this journey with us, because healing doesn't always come in big dramatic moments. Sometimes it starts with hearing someone say, "Me too." Let's begin. Lesson 1. There's never enough time. Susan used to believe that 31 years was a long time to love someone, until the day she lost him. In the weeks after her husband passed, she found herself whispering the same words over and over again. Just one more day. She would have given anything for one more conversation, one more quiet morning with coffee and no plans, one more moment to reach across the bed and feel him there. Whether it's 1 year, 10 years, or 5 decades, the truth is always the same. It never feels like enough. The people around her tried to remind her how lucky she was. "You had a beautiful marriage," they'd say. "Not everyone gets that." And she knew they were right. But grief doesn't count years. Grief remembers touch, voice, the way he used to squeeze her hand twice when they were walking, the way he looked at her when she laughed at her own jokes. Susan learned that it's not about how long you were together. It's about the depth of the connection. And when that connection is real, losing it always feels too soon. She no longer says, "We had 31 years. Now she says, "It wasn't enough time." And that's okay, because love, real love, never feels finished. Lesson 2. You're never truly prepared. Susan always believed she was the type to be ready for anything. She and her husband had talked about what-if scenarios. They had life insurance. They had a folder labeled "just in case." She thought that meant she was prepared. But when the day came, when her husband slipped away quietly in a hospital room that smelled like hand sanitizer and old flowers, she realized nothing could have prepared her for the silence that followed. At first, there were practical things: the funeral arrangements, the death certificate, the endless phone calls to banks, insurance companies, Social Security. But the emotional wave hit harder than any of that. She wasn't ready for the sound of just one coffee cup clinking in the sink, or for the cold side of the bed that never warmed up again. She wasn't ready to throw out his prescription bottles or to see his toothbrush sitting untouched. No one had told her that planning for death doesn't mean preparing for grief. You can have all the papers in order and still fall apart trying to cancel your husband's email account. You can know what day the funeral will be and still forget how to breathe when you hear his favorite song at the grocery store. Being truly prepared, she learned, isn't about documents or legal checklists. It's about learning how to keep living when the person you planned your life with is no longer there to share it. And that kind of preparation? No one teaches you how to do that. Lesson 3. The smallest words become sacred. It was just a notebook, Nothing fancy. Soft blue cover, a few pages filled in, the rest blank. Susan's husband had started it sometime in his final month, when the pain medications left his handwriting shaky and his energy thin. Inside were small messages for their 2 children. One said, "Be proud of yourself. You've got more strength than you know." Another said, "Don't forget to laugh, even when life is hard." There weren't many entries, just a few lines for each child, some incomplete thoughts. At first, Susan felt heartbroken that it wasn't more, that he hadn't had time or clarity to finish everything he wanted to say. But as the days passed, that little notebook became her most treasured object. She read it every night like scripture. Each sentence, no matter how brief, held his voice, his humor, his care, his love. She realized then that it doesn't take paragraphs or perfect wording to say something meaningful. Sometimes, a few sincere words are enough to carry someone through years of grief. Now, Susan tells people, don't wait for the right moment to write it all down. Say, "I love you" in texts. Leave sticky notes on the fridge. Record your laugh. Send a voice message. Write that short letter. Because someday, what feels like just a few simple words may be the most sacred thing someone has left. Lesson 4. Relief is real. And so is the guilt that follows. Susan had been watching her husband fade for months. The man who used to mow the lawn before breakfast was now struggling to sit up in bed. Cancer took his strength first, then his appetite, then his voice. Toward the end, the pain was constant, and the medications were barely keeping up. So when he finally passed, Susan exhaled, not out of joy, not even peace, just relief. He wasn't suffering anymore. No more emergency room visits, no more watching him wince while pretending he was fine. But the next emotion hit harder: guilt. How could she feel relief when her husband, the man she had loved for over 3 decades, had just died? She kept that feeling to herself. For weeks, she didn't tell anyone. It felt wrong, shameful even. She thought grief was supposed to look like endless sobbing, not a calm sense of release. But over time, and in quiet conversations with other widows, she realized something important. Relief is a normal human reaction to prolonged suffering, even when it follows deep love. She wasn't relieved that he was gone. She was relieved that he no longer had to hurt. That understanding gave her space to grieve honestly, without guilt, without shame. She learned that grief isn't black and white. It's full of contradictions: sadness and calm, despair and gratitude, heartbreak and healing, all at once. And maybe the hardest part of loss is learning that all of it can be true at the same time. Lesson 5. Grief can bring out the worst in people. Susan had always believed that loss would bring people together, that family and friends would support one another in a time of sorrow. But what she didn't expect, and no one had warned her about, was how grief could tear people apart. In the days after her husband's passing, there were arguments over the will, tension over who got what, hurt feelings about who was left out, even if nothing had ever been promised. She heard harsh words spoken in whispers when they thought she couldn't hear. Family members who hadn't shown up in months now suddenly had strong opinions about funeral details. Friends who were once close started to disappear, or worse, say things that stung. Grief, Susan realized, doesn't just bring sadness. It brings stress, vulnerability, old wounds. And sometimes, that mix leads people to act in ways you never imagined they could. At first, she blamed herself. But later, she learned that grief doesn't always show up as tears. Sometimes it shows up as anger, resentment, or silence. She let go of what she couldn't control, and she held tight to the few people who showed up with kindness, not criticism. Loss doesn't change people, it reveals them. Lesson 6. People will be there at first, and then they won't. In the first week after her husband passed, Susan's house was full. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. Friends brought flowers. There were sympathy cards on the counter, voicemails full of tearful voices saying, "Call me if you need anything." And she didn't want any of it. At the time, she couldn't eat. She couldn't hold a conversation without breaking down. All she really wanted was to be left alone with her memories. But then, a few months passed. The meals stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. And suddenly, the silence she once craved became unbearable. That was when the real weight of grief settled in, not during the funeral, but long after. When the world had moved on, but she hadn't. She didn't blame people. They were busy. They meant well. But grief doesn't follow the same timeline as sympathy cards. The hardest part, Susan said, was realizing she had a small window when it was socially acceptable to be sad. After that, people expected her to be okay, to smile again, get back to normal, move forward. But her normal was gone. And what she needed most wasn't casseroles or condolences. It was someone to sit beside her, months later, and simply ask, "How are you doing?" Really? Lesson 7. People will say the wrong things. Susan heard it all. He's in a better place. At least he's not suffering. Everything happens for a reason. You're young enough. Maybe you'll find love again. Some people meant well. Some were just uncomfortable. Most didn't know what else to say. So they said the first cliché that came to mind. But every time someone tried to explain her loss away, it made her feel even more alone, as if their need to comfort themselves was more important than simply sitting with her pain. One person even said, "Well, at least you got to say goodbye?" As if that somehow made it easier. As if goodbye could ever feel good. She knew they weren't trying to be cruel. But their words stung, because what she really needed wasn't advice or silver linings. She needed honesty, simplicity, a hand on her shoulder, a look in the eyes that said, "This is awful, and I'm here with you in it." So now, when Susan meets another widow, she doesn't try to fix anything. She just listens. Because in grief, the kindest words are often the simplest. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say, but I'm here." And sometimes, nothing at all. Just presence, steady and true. Lesson 8. You will be triggered by the smallest, strangest things. No one prepared Susan for the landmines. She expected the big moments to hurt. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. She knew Christmas would be quiet and lonely, and that his birthday in March would bring tears. But what caught her off guard were the little, ordinary things. The peanut butter brand he always bought, the sound of a certain ringtone that used to be his, a military commercial on TV with the same music they played at his funeral. One time, it was a gas station. She was driving to work, past a corner they used to stop at for coffee, and burst into tears without warning. Another time, it was a Veterans Day church service. The moment the pastor asked all the veterans to stand and be honored, and Susan realized her veteran wasn't there to stand anymore. What shattered her most was New Year's Eve, 6 months after he died. The moment the clock struck midnight and the calendar turned from the year he died into a year he would never live in. It felt like time had moved on without him, like she was being pulled forward while he was left behind. Triggers, she learned, don't always make sense. They're not always predictable, and they don't follow any rulebook. Sometimes, grief lives in the details. In the cereal aisle, in the empty chair at a restaurant, in the way you catch yourself laughing, and then suddenly feel guilty for forgetting the weight, even for a moment. Susan stopped trying to predict the pain. Instead, she gave herself permission to feel it, even when it came from the smallest, strangest things. Lesson 9. You become a new person. Susan never imagined how much losing her husband would change her, not just emotionally, but in her very identity. Before he died, she was a wife, a teacher, a mother, a friend. She was someone who packed 2 lunches every day and texted her husband to see if he'd be home for dinner. After the funeral, she felt like she was someone else entirely. People started calling her widow, a word she never thought would describe her in her 50s. At the doctor's office, on paperwork, in polite conversation, "Are you married?" The word no came out like a stone in her mouth. But it wasn't just labels. It was the deep sense that the person she used to be had vanished overnight. She no longer had a partner to bounce decisions off of. She had to find her voice again, not just to make choices, but to stand up for herself in a world that now saw her as just one. For a while, she felt lost. But in that space, that quiet, painful space, she found something else: strength. She learned to fix the sink, pay the bills, plan holidays alone. She learned to say, "I don't know," without shame, and to ask for help when she needed it. And little by little, she became someone new. Not just a woman who had lost her husband, but a woman who had survived that loss, who had grown from it, who had depth, resilience, and empathy she never knew she had. She didn't stop being a wife in her heart, but she also became something else, someone she could be proud of. Lesson 10. Life becomes before and after. When people asked Susan about memories, a vacation, a funny story, a family moment, she found herself placing everything on a mental timeline. "Oh, that was before he died." Or, "That happened after." It wasn't intentional. It just happened. Losing her husband split her life in half, like a tree that's been struck by lightning. There was everything before June 12th, and everything after. The before version of her life felt brighter, more whole, like it belonged to someone else. The after version was quieter, more fragile, and marked by an absence that never fully left. Even happy things, her daughter's graduation, a new grandbaby, a holiday dinner, came with an asterisk. He would have loved this. He should be here. At first, it felt like she was betraying him every time she smiled, like moving forward meant leaving him behind. But in time, she realized something powerful. The split didn't have to mean separation. The before version of her life could still live inside her, in her memories, her stories, her habits, even in her sense of humor. She began to understand that grief doesn't end the moment a life does. It carries forward, woven into every new experience, every day she continues on. So she stopped drawing a line between before and after. Instead, she learned to carry both. To be someone who once had a beautiful marriage, and who now has the strength to live with both the joy and the ache. Lesson 11. Death no longer scares you the same way. Before losing her husband, Susan rarely thought about death. It was something that belonged to old age or accidents on the news. It was out there, far away. She believed, like many people do, that death was something to be feared, avoided, or at least ignored for as long as possible. But after watching her husband die, her view shifted. He had battled cancer for nearly a year. She saw him fight, struggle, and eventually let go, not out of weakness, but out of peace. She held his hand through it all. She was there when he took his final breath. And in that moment, she said, it didn't feel terrifying. It felt gentle. What surprised her most in the months that followed was this newfound peace with the idea of her own mortality. She had looked death in the face. It had taken the man she loved most in the world, but it hadn't destroyed her. She still missed him every day. She still cried when their song came on the radio, or when she passed his favorite fishing spot. But she no longer lay awake at night, terrified of what would come at the end of her own life. Because now, she imagined death not as a dark wall, but as a doorway. A return. A reunion. She believed he was waiting for her, not in a spooky or dramatic way, but in the quiet way that love lingers. That brought her comfort, not fear. Susan still wanted to live. She still had birthdays to celebrate, grandkids to hold, sunrises to witness. But when her time came, she wouldn't meet it with panic. She had already walked beside death once, and she had survived it. And now, she understood something deeper. Love doesn't end with the last breath. It stays. It softens the fear. It gives us something to look toward instead of something to run from. Lesson 12. There's no right way to grieve. In the weeks after her husband passed, Susan found herself looking for a guidebook. Not a literal one, but something, anything, that could tell her if she was doing this grief thing correctly. Because for something so universal, so deeply human, it was strange how uncertain she felt about her own sadness. Some days she cried constantly. Other days, she barely felt anything. Some mornings she got up, made coffee, folded the laundry, and almost forgot, for a single guilt-ridden second, that he was gone. And that's when the questions began. Not from other people, but from within. Was she grieving too fast? Too slow? Too privately? She looked around and saw other widows handling it differently. Some couldn't get out of bed for months. Some filled their days with activities. Others seemed almost untouched by it all. Composed, graceful, as if they had skipped the suffering entirely. Susan, by contrast, felt like a pendulum, swinging between calm and chaos, between numbness and heartbreak, and she began to wonder if something was wrong with her. She felt guilty for not crying at the funeral, ashamed for laughing at a comedy movie with her son 2 weeks later, conflicted when she found herself putting on lipstick one morning and catching a glimpse of herself in the mirror that didn't look entirely broken. And then came the outside voices, well-meaning friends who said, "Stay busy, that's the best way," or, "He'd want you to move on." And the worst one, the one that stuck like a splinter, "You're handling this so well." As if there were a scorecard, as if the only way to show you loved deeply was to fall apart completely. But Susan wasn't falling apart. She was holding herself together in small, quiet ways, by showing up for her kids, by going to church even when her seat beside the aisle was empty, by breathing through the long nights. Still, the doubt lingered. It wasn't until she met other widows, months later in a small support group at the community center, that she finally heard the words she needed. There's no right way to grieve. Grief isn't a straight road. It's not a staircase where each step is progress and the top is healed. It's messy. It circles back. It surprises you at random moments, in the grocery store, in the garden, in a song you haven't heard in years. Susan learned that grieving is not about checking off stages. It's not about how long you cry or how soon you laugh. It's not about how visible your pain is or how quickly you get back to normal. Because the truth is, there is no normal after a loss like that. There's only new. She started to trust her own process. She stopped apologizing for the good days. She stopped explaining the hard ones. She gave herself permission to smile at strangers, to go on walks, to feel okay, even when the world expected her to stay broken a little longer. And perhaps most importantly, she stopped comparing her grief to anyone else's. Because grief, she realized, is love, still alive, still moving, still finding its way through the cracks of a changed life. So now, when someone asks her what it's like to lose your spouse, she doesn't try to explain the pain. She simply says, "It's different for everyone, and however you feel, that's okay." Because grieving isn't a performance. It's not something to do right. It's something to live through, with honesty, with patience, and with grace for yourself, even on the days when you think you should be farther along. Susan is still grieving. She probably always will. But now, she knows that grief is not the enemy. It's the echo of a love that mattered, a love that still matters. And there is nothing wrong with carrying that love, in whatever way your heart knows how. The quiet bravery of carrying on. Susan never thought she'd be standing on this side of grief. In those first days, the heavy ones, when even brushing her teeth felt like too much, she couldn't see past the next 5 minutes, let alone the next 5 months. But slowly, with no map and no script, she kept walking. She made coffee for one. She learned to sleep on her side of the bed. She sat through holidays with an empty chair at the table. She found ways to speak about him in past tense, even when it broke her. And in doing all that, she became someone new. Not someone who got over it. Not someone who forgot. But someone who chose to carry the love forward, even when it came with weight. She came to understand that grief never really leaves you. It changes form. It softens around the edges. It sits beside you, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, as you begin, little by little, to live again. Not in spite of your loss, but with it. If you're listening to this now and you've lost someone, recently or long ago, know that Susan's story is your story too. Maybe not the details, but the ache, the adjustment, the small wins, the slow rebuild. There is no finish line in grief. There is no done. But there is still beauty. There is still meaning. There is still life. A different life, yes, but a life worth living. And in that life, your loved one isn't left behind. They walk with you, in memory, in love, in the quiet moments between one breath and the next. So take your time. Let yourself feel it all. Cry when it comes. Laugh when it surprises you. And above all, never think you're weak for grieving. Because there is a quiet kind of bravery in carrying on. And that bravery, it looks a lot like you.